Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. I was just feeling gratitude of people willing to come out in what has been a very stormy day and see a full house like this. It's very heartwarming. I was just sitting and thinking as Mel was talking that what an extraordinary place this is. The council is the largest council in the country and has done the most marvelous job of reaching out to recovering people and has made an extraordinary difference in the Houston recovery community. And Mel Taylor and his staff have done an extraordinary job, and it's an example to the rest of the country. And your being here tonight is an example of the kinds of things that they do. And I think we should recognize not only the staff, who I see all sitting down here together, but also the work that Mel has done for a long, long time. And let's thank him for that. It was in 1995, and I was looking for work. And I had myself been to the Meadows in seeking help for my own issues, 1980, 81, 82. My dad had started drinking after 30 years of sobriety, and it kind of shook my timbers. And so I had a therapist said, you needed to go to a place to unravel. And I walked into the Meadows, and I was sitting that first morning in treatment, and a woman by the name of Pia Melody got up, and she started talking about out of the shadows, which was stunning to me because I never heard anybody else but me talk about it at that time. And I was very moved by that and welcomed, and I made friends with Pat Melody, and he invited me to come to the Meadows, and I thought, you know, here you have Pia there, you had me there, and I went to Pat and I said, you know, I think we have an opportunity if we could pull people together that are really working in the recovery field and pull their talents, what could we do? He says, who do you have in mind? And I made a list. And the first one that came was Claudia Black, who's been a good colleague of both John's and mine for a long time. And then Claudia and we also felt very strongly that John should be with us. And so I got to start working with John, and it's been a wonderful work relation. I've known him since the 80s. We had done things together, and we'd been fishing, and kids had been in my home, we've been in each other's homes, and we also knew the agony of writing. And one of the things that I've grown to appreciate over time about that group of people, and about John in particular tonight, I want to say this to you. This hasn't been easy, this thing we call recovery. Standing up and putting a book together, a book will bring you to your knees. And both John and I have been there. And every book, it's like another, it's really like a marriage in a way. It's like you never leave it. It's always there, and the agony you went to bring it into life. And John Bradshaw has been a companion for me in my writing and in my work for all these years, and has helped me so much in that. And one of the things that I think that is one of his greatest accomplishments is he took concepts that were really very complex that people didn't know, and he put words on it. He put it in a way that average folks could access and make their own the things we've learned about human behavior. That's an extraordinary gift to be able to translate that for people. We have a foundation called the American Foundation for Addiction Research, and last year our board gave John a recognition for his moving, a recognition award for over his lifetime, how he has moved the whole recovery movement forward by being a person who could synthesize and pull from things and make sense to all of us. The other thing that I was thinking about, because John and I had dinner last night, and I told him something that I had not had a chance to say to him. The book that he wrote before he wrote Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, it was about virtue and reclaiming integrity. I think it's the best book John ever did. And the thing that struck me about it is I watched him work on that for years. And his thinking about it, the clarity was original. It's an extraordinary book. It's a great gift. And not only is he a great synthesizer, but he's been a great original thinker. And I don't think people have really credited with what he has brought to the recovery movement. So I truly, and I don't know how many times you and I will do this, where we're both together like this. So this is kind of a rare opportunity for me to be able to say, this is the man that I admire. Would you join me in welcoming John Bradshaw? How'd I do, Johnny?
Hello? Can you hear me? Yes. The old voice is getting very scraggly these days, and I mean no disrespect by sitting down, I just can't stand up very long. So if you don't mind, I'm going to present from here. I thank you for that, Pat. We have a mutual admiration, and we've had our fights along the way, so we're great buddies, 36 years now. So that's a great thing. I wrote this book on post-traumatic stress disorder, both out of my own life experience and out of the many people I counseled over a 20-year period. I began to see people throw away what were perfectly good marriages. They just had reached the end of the cycle of in love. And up to that time, at least when I was counseling, I didn't know about the brain chemistry that's involved in what Helen Fisher has presented to us after 5 years of research with fMRI streaming pictures of the brain in love, in lust, and in attachment. And I suddenly thought, oh my God, that whole in love brain explains a lot for me. Like, boy, I now know what I was doing. And it is inherently addictive, that brain. But it is also presented to us, nature evolved it, or God evolved it, or the force evolved it, in order that we would meet, mate, and procreate. Because nature wants us to extend our DNA in space and time. Lust is different than in love. And Helen showed they have a completely different brain chemistry. That lust has often been referred to as the oldest lion of them all. It's simply nature's way of continuing. So without lust, the human race would die out in 100 years. But lust and love are not the same. In lust, and my wife said you shouldn't put that on there, coyote sex, which is a joke a lot of you know. A guy has sex with a woman, he's finished, and he wants to get out of there as fast as he can. She cuddles up and puts her arm around him, so he bites his arm off to get out of it. And that is very chauvinistic. Women experience the same thing. I had many female clients that were into, casual sex. And they said, I want to get out of there when it's over with. In love, you want to be with that person as long as you can possibly be. You don't want to leave. You don't want to separate. So what Helen found is the brain in love is a very distinct brain program, and that it's very different from lust. Although when you fall in love, you may begin to lust. Occasionally, lust leads to in love, so be careful of, casual sex, because, it can lead to being in love, but in love is a completely different brain program. Nature evolved it, now listen to this, not for long-term relationships. That's not what it evolved for. It evolved to be this incredibly powerful, instinctual, innate force. That's what Helen found. She talked about in her book, The Anatomy of Love, that she was startled to realize that this wasn't a feeling, it was an instinct, it was an urge. It was something that we're born with that program. We fall in love with our mamas and sometimes our daddies, although that's tougher sometimes, although Pat did the great mothering job with his kids. But anyway, so the in love is a program that is triggered by whatever we now know that we're mostly attracted to symmetry. You look at Denzel Washington's face, and it's the same on both sides. It's Aristotle's golden mean. But symmetry, so hip to waist ratio. Doesn't matter how heavy the gal is, it's good. You have good hip to waist ratio, that's all that counts. And many guys, they don't have to have slender Playboy bunnies. They like hip to waist ratio and proportionate breasts, although probably more on the large size, but whatever. And so the character, I may be revealing too much up here. And I'm going to tell you something, I'm actually a backside man. And I can tell you about evolution, it was all done from the backside. And I've thought about writing a book the day the bonobos stood up. Because the women began to look for large penises. That was a tragedy to some of us. But anyway, so people are attracted by men. Women tend to like tall, I said tend to like, you may not, tall men. There's a whole issue of nature wants to make babies and wants them to be healthy. So men may look for women that look sturdy, can be good mothers, etc. And men and women look to men that seem to, when I was single at 1989, I thought, I'm done, I can't handle any of this. But I had at the time 2 ranches and had done pretty well thanks to you and others. And I just didn't think I'd be attractive. I was very attractive, believe me. Anyway, and so it amazed me. But women want security. They want somebody that's going to take care of them and take care of the offspring and be able to raise the offspring. So those are very important things in the attraction. The in love is like an altered state of consciousness. It's a swoon you go into. And you are in a bona fide altered state of consciousness when you are in love with somebody. James Hollis, the great Jungian therapist, says you can't do therapy with people who are in love because they're just gone. They're just out of it. They're talking baby talk to each other. If you're out with them, it's terrible. Gucci and hi honey pea and Cupid's arrow. You regress to a state of symbiotic bonding. You regress to the earliest states of enmeshment, codependence. And so when couples are in love, they're in that in that codependent, symbiotic swoon, and all the characteristics, exclusivity, that all of its destiny, its fate. I never thought I'd meet anybody like you. You like molasses on your cereal. I never thought you went to high school and I went to high school. For goodness sake. This is incredible. You went to London when you were 14 and so did I, although they're 35 years apart. But it's astonishing. I looked over at my dear wife and I saw a coin. It was from a 14th century sunken ship. And I had one too. The same coin. Well, that sealed it, baby. So that destiny and fate and then ownership. Now that's a good thing, but it's also a very bad thing when we come to what I call fourth degree PRSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That's about battering, it's about stalking, it's about love suicide, it's about love homicide. So we're not dealing with something Mickey Mouse here. The power of that in love, nature makes it so strong, but it's an altered state of consciousness. And when you're in it, your testosterone shoots off the chart. A woman who's a 4 becomes a 9. The guy thinks he died and went to heaven. The sexual desire and what I call the amazing sex when you're in love. And, it may not be for some couples, but most people report it as amazing. And it's so powerful. And then what triggers the whole program is increased phenylethylamine. It's probably wrong the way I said that, but that then triggers the amphetamine-like neurotransmitters of dopamine, norepinephrine, and reduces serotonin, which is the source of all the obsessive compulsiveness. Talking 8 hours on the phone. I did that one time. And always when I tell it, someone raises their hand and said, were there bathroom breaks? And there were. But that crazy wanting to be with them, wanting to touch them, wanting to hold them, wanting to hear their voice. I had my first loves, after I was divorced, I had my first love's voice on my cell phone in my car. And anybody that got in the car had to hear her answer her phone, her message on the phone. I'd say, listen to this, and dial her number. And they were looking over at me like, come on, man, drive the car. But anyway, it's that incredible desire to be together. See, nature, what a smart thing nature does. So nature wants us to extend our DNA in space and time and tries to capitalize on this force of nature, this, I call it the PEA dopamine cocktail. It's like you took that cocktail and you just went crazy. And you now can lose weight effortlessly. You are willing to do things you never thought you could do before. And on and on. I gave a whole bunch of, now here's the kicker. The program only lasts 12 to 18 months. And it's over. Now, most of the time, people are married when this baby kicks off. What happens when it ends is your testosterone goes back to normal. So if a woman might be, and women often have greater testosterone than men. And I say that because I thought I was going to die when I was courting my wife. You can fill in the blanks. But anyway, when that program ends, all of a sudden you go back to normal. I mean, you were skipping work, you were doing all kind of things, you were revved up, and suddenly, I gotta get to work, I can't. But the big thing that happens, and I put it in the preface of the book, he reaches over, he does something that's automatic foreplay. They've been doing it for 18 months. And she says, or he says, let's just cuddle tonight. And that is what my friend, I have a psychologist friend in LA, Jay Wagner, he's got a whole book outline called The Breach. And that first moment when one or the other says, let's just cuddle, when you've been doing an automatic behavior for 18 months, is a breach. You experience, all of a sudden you were one and now you're alone. Now you're separate. And frequently the guy will say, fine. Oh, that's fine, but that doesn't mean fine, ladies. That means I'm keeping score here and you're going to get it for this. Now, what happens is in 100 studies, American people have said that they think that love is based on sexual desire. So all of a sudden, this begins to dwindle, the sexual desire, because you've got stuff to do. You've got to get busy. You got to go back to work, for God's sake. And it's not a pretty picture when it ends. But God, you young women, get this in your head. You don't have to have babies and get married necessarily. I mean, I can tell you that early teenage marriages have plagued my whole psycho family history. And every place I see it, there's disaster. So we've got to, this book, I hope everybody will give it to their kids and say, read this, try to understand it before you get into it. Because once you're in a swoon, forget it. I've given this to a couple people in my family who are in swoons. I call them a month, hey, did you read? Not a bit, Papa. I didn't have time. I was with Shirley Jane most of the time. Yeah, I know it. That's why I'm giving you this book. But anyway, so in love then, and there's, if you've been in love, you know all the bit. There's many other characteristics of it. You talk endlessly. You want to be with each other all the time. And you feel special, like the two of you have something and it's yours alone that has been kismet, it's fate and destiny, and ownership. When you see O.J. holding his wife up by the crotch and saying, this is mine. That is an example of that in love ownership and some male dysfunction. But it's that ownership thing is what causes the later stuff about stalking and abusing. And I mean, it's one of the factors in that. And the fact is that what Dr. Pat Carnes, what P.M. Melody elaborated on, the in-love addiction, is this program right here. It's the most powerful in all of nature. So you set that up with a person who's already severely shame-based codependent, and they're going to have a terrible time, especially if they're the ones that, are the high T and they get rejected. It feels like a breach, feels like rejection. You thought you knew your wife and you're at a party. You want to go home. The wife says, I'm not going home. You go by yourself. Breach. And what Jay Wagner has discovered is that is the beginning of many divorces, that breach. Now, the third brain program, and I put little brains on here. I mean, I don't know a thing about the brain, really. But I put brains on there to look pretty good. That what Helen found is it's another program. And we actually have this as an innate program. We have this from the moment of our birth, a program potentially ready to be enacted. Now, we know from studies like the Infant Strange and others that attachment can be very avoidant, it can be mixed up and crazy. So whatever your attachment was in those earliest days will be a factor in your in-love days. And so you have to be really careful about that. if you are insecurely attracted, you may cling on to this person, and they become your new source, safe figure, and it's very hard. And then when this love is unrequited, it can be a terrible, terrible. I think it's worse than dying almost to go through a love rejection. That's just my opinion, but it has to happen because the program's going to end. So I called. It depends on early attachment. If attachment was faulty, actualizing it will be more difficult. And see, a lot of codependent sex addicts, we just cling. I mean, all I had to hear in elementary school is some girl liked me, and I immediately liked her. I mean, she was my soulmate. Because I didn't risk telling some girl I liked her to be rejected. So if any girl liked me, woo, she was in like Flynn. That was it. But anyway, moving right along. And so the more you have a solid sense of self, the more this is going to work itself out. You won't take the breach. You'll only take it as something mild. If you can get some knowledge about it. Ram Dass said, one moment of awareness can change the most stuck relationship. And so I've written this for people who are in what I call third degree, who are like ships passing in the night, who haven't had sex for 5, 10 years, and they've just resigned themselves to a marriage that's not going to be fun in the sense of having that part of your life active and fulfilled. So we need to know about this. I mean, it's the same kind of thing that Dr. Carnes is on now with finding all the brain chemistry of sexual addiction and showing that this is stuff that really impacts our brains. And we've got to understand how powerful it is. So I call post-romantic disorder, in the romance period, you have no problems. You see the faults, but they're not problems. So the woman comes to me after 2 bad marriages and says, I'm dating this new guy, Ralphie. And I say, well, tell me about Ralphie. Well, on the second date, he's the most honest man I've ever met. On the second date, he told me he had killed a man. And she's looking at me, and I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm supposed to be a therapist, but I don't know what to do. I mean, her eyes are glazed over. Ralphie's the most honest man. He's a criminal. He's a murderer. Anyway, moving right along. So the high risk people for post-traumatic stress disorder are codependents, addicts, shame-based people, all of that we've been dealing with in recovery over all these years. And let me say something about this center here now. I got my sobriety 49 years and 9 months ago by walking into this place. And that, folks, is a very long time between drinks. But thank God for it. And what Mel, at this whole unit here, I helped Mary Bell form the Center for Recovering Families, but it's gotten much larger than that. And Mel saw from the get-go what Pat saw, and I began to see that it's not about an addiction, it's about addictiveness. And that's because you got a wound, you got a trauma, you got a hole in your soul. You got something going on that's empty. It's like a black hole in there. So put the cork on the bottle. I'm Mr. AA 9 years later. Start acting out sexually. I haven't cured the wound. The wound is deeper. I got to go deeper to clear that wound. Pat is running the Gentle Path Treatment Center at the Meadows. Pat and I are both senior fellow Meadows. And that's a tremendous program, but it gets at the addictiveness. It's the hole in the soul. It's the root of the alcoholism. And that addictiveness, you're set up for any addiction. You can get addicted to anything. So in any case, it's so important that there's healing, because once a couple begins to experience this, and then see, when you're in love, you don't have any problems. You reframe everything. It's called limerence. You reframe everything. You see the faults, but I can stop Billy from his cocaine and morphine addiction. I know that. Love will fix that. And you're the therapist. You're just about to pass out. I mean, it's just, you don't know what to do. This person is crazy as a loon. And they won't listen to a word you're saying. Anytime you say something, they reframe it in some positive way, which is a nice thing to be able to do, but not when you have a morphine-addicted sex addict for a boyfriend. That's going to require something more. So stage 2, stage 1 is generally, in my opinion, the breach that happens when all this testosterone moves into attachment, which is vasopressin, oxytocin, the cuddle chemicals. Nature's preparing us to have families and to continue our line in space and time. And you all know that in the final analysis, there's nothing that matters without a family. That family, will be the best thing in your life. It'll last. It'll be there with you when you die. A lot of the other folk won't be there. But that family becomes the most important thing in our lives. And the rigorous honesty about that and the healing that needs to go on with that. So, in any case, in that phase where there are no problems, I'd say to counselees, God, that's a problem. She has a guy in her church that gave her a $350,000 house and is sending your children to a special school and gave you $500,000 life insurance. What's the deal there? Oh, he's just a friend. He likes me. I failed as a therapist, believe me. I know what to do with that kind of stuff. Just call you kooky and get out. And I did at the end. I was so, are you crazy as a loon? I'm out of here. I can't help you anymore. But stage 2 is what happens because you don't take any of the problems. You're Catholic, charismatic, and he's Jewish Orthodox. That's going to really work out. Those things are not even considered when you're in love. And then the differences. The funniest case I ever had is this couple. The guy had been very repressed in his sexuality and never talked about, never said anything. He had a gal that they were very open about it. So on their honeymoon, they had been virgins. They'd committed to be virgins. On their honeymoon, she says, at the height of foreplay, touch my wanini. Well, he has no idea what a wanini is. He's not about to touch something. But he does, and it's wrong. He got it wrong. It's uncanny. I had a guy in my office one time talking about his Billy Ray Dill for 45 minutes. And kept saying, my wife doesn't even care about my Billy Ray Dill. And I'm trying to figure out, is it? I guess it's the penis. I don't know what else it could be. See, I think we should have at the marriage ceremony one part where you say, these are my waninis, these are my tatas, this is my dodo. So the guy knows when you get married. You have to work through all that stuff. In any case, stage 2 is working through all that stuff. And the family of origin stuff, and your wounds from the past. What we've realized in our work over the years is that you've got to heal those wounds from the past, because they become what I saw 1,000,000 times, maybe that's an exaggeration, but child, two kids fighting. You got the most. You never have any time. You never spend any time with a kid. You what? Two kids fighting. And we got to get those kids grown up. And so that inner child work that we do at the Meadows, and I think it's the most powerful single therapy there is, it's trying to heal the past. And so you haven't taken any of that when you're in love. So in healing this, marriage moves from the same patterns. You're born codependent, symbiotic bonding. You move to counterdependency. Little kids saying, no, it's mine, I won't. I had a little girl over the other day. I mean, it was uncanny. You say red, she say black. And she just, 4 years old, strutting around. But it's the self coming out. It's solid selfhood. That's mine. Boundary. No, I won't. Boundary. Setting bound. I'm somebody. But we don't get that. My old patriarchal upbringing, you whack the kids and, put them into shape. So you have to work through all those wounds from the past, and you go through a counterdependency stage when you're you're moving from eros, the in love, to agape, to a love that's a substantial, deep love, and that takes work. In love is not work. It's spontaneous. You don't have to do anything, really. Once you marry, once you come together to commit, it's work. You got to work at it. You got to be willing to compromise. You got to be docile. You got to be willing to learn. And all that's difficult. You don't bargain for that because in love's so easy. And suddenly you've got to do all that, and these are all. You got to go from codependence to counterdependence to independence. So one of the great things about a deep love in marriage is that you become the custodians of each other's self-actualization. David Snorch, who's done a lot of work on sexual desire and the lack of it, talks about you can't have sexual desire if you don't have a solid sense of self. If you don't have a sense of self, you can't give yourself to your partner. So one of the things that happens, and I call it the third phase of a love, a growing love, is that you become the custodians. You help each other actualize yourself. And it means being patient, and it means caring about the other's self-actualization. Once you're there, then, if I have a self, I can give myself. Rabbi Mendel, if I am I because I am I, and you're you because you're you, then I am and you are. But if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not and you are not. Say that again, John. If I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, then I am and you are. But if I am not and you are not, I kind of botched that up, but it's... it's like I don't have a self, I just hang on. We're like two people in a canoe. Last stage would be two people making music together, and each one plays their own instrument. They have their independence, but they make music together. That's a long journey. That's a hard journey. And it's something that very much not what in love's about. And so it's a journey, and one of the great things we have now is some really great work, and Pat will talk about how he's advanced the studies that he's done with the neuroscience of the brain. But the brain work of Jeffrey Schwartz and Sarah Begley at UCLA, they found that the will has been a subject that's been discussed in philosophy for years, that the will is a powerful physical force. They took OCD people who had that obsessive compulsiveness. They took pictures of their brains. They did a 10-week program, or 16-week, I can't remember how long it was, where it was based on four steps. First one was, that's my sick brain talking. I mean, we could do this with alcoholism, or, I think I need it. Well, that's your sick brain talking. and then find something else to do, mood alter, meditate, go for a walk. Anyway, over 10, 12, 15 weeks, whatever it was, they took a picture of their brains at the end of that. And all that stuff around the caudate nucleus and the part of the brain that is the part that has that compulsion had been uncanny. He's got the pictures. Their book is called The Mind and the Brain. It's unbelievable. What he ends it with is that the will is a physical force that can change the brain. I've heard Pat say, in this day and time, we could really make a whole new brain because of neuroplasticity. Those have been the great new things, and there are many others. But I have the whole part of my book of helping people is believe that your willpower can change your brain and can change your feelings, if you change your brain, you're going to change the way you behave. I heard it years ago in AA, you act yourself into a right way of feeling and thinking. Don't try to think and act yourself or feel yourself into a right way of acting. You have to act yourself. And so the whole second half of my program for people recovering from PTSD is that you use your willpower and you don't try to change your partner, you change yourself. That's the only way real change will come. So that's in summary what I've been excited about for the last 3 years or so. I was doing it. We trademarked post-romantic years ago. But I didn't have the data. I didn't have the empirical data that Helen Fisher presented. She's a good buddy of mine now, and I'd like to do a PBS series with her and have her present some of the stuff she's found. It's really extraordinary. Anyway, that's my bit for tonight. Anyway, now it's my real honor to introduce my colleague. We're both senior fellows at the Meadows Treatment Center. Lots of you know about the Meadows. It's been very much something that Houston people have gotten a lot of recovery from. Pat is a senior fellow there. He also developed what is called the Gentle Path program. He's the executive director of that. When I was there last, they have a beautiful facility, and Pat is directing that at the Meadows. Now, Pat has, that's the least of what Pat has done, although that's a great thing. He also founded the International Institute for Professionals in Trauma and Addiction, ITAP, International Institute for Trauma and Addiction. And he has been the head of that, and it's grown immensely. He was given a life award by the Society for Advancing Sexual Health, SASH. He was given that lifetime award. He was also, they give out a Carnes Award every year for distinguished researchers and people who have advanced the field of sexual addiction. Pat has been that. He was awarded the honor of being the top therapist of the year in 2000. He has more honors than I could possibly tell you about. What I love about Pat is that I was sitting there in therapy one day, 1978. I had about 5 guys that were clearly sex addicts, but I didn't know it at the time. One guy comes in with Out of the Shadows, which is his monumental, incredible book that started the whole new consciousness about sex and love addiction. He had that book and he said, I think I'm a sex addict. Well, I hadn't helped him a bit, primarily because I had my own issues and didn't want to look at it. And so I said, well, let me see that book. From that book, on August the 13th of 1981, I ended all my serious problem with sexuality. And I attribute it dynamically to Pat Carnes. So I now introduce you my buddy, sweetest guy in the world. If you knew him in person, he's just as sweet as he looks. I mean, a scholar, a pioneer. This guy does the research. He had a lot of trouble in the beginning. People didn't want to accept that there was such a thing. Now we know the suffering that it causes. So without ado, I introduce my friend and colleague, Patrick Carnes.
You know what's funny about that? Is we both have been coached to rein the other in. And I feel like I've already lost it. Well, it matters a lot to me that you and I are here talking about this. And when John told me he wanted to talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder concept and what had happened to people, the idea came up for me of talking about relationships and the kinds of things that we are seeing in sexuality and relationships. And thinking about what John said, that having a relationship over the long term is hard work. And the place that I thought I would start is that we are living in a time, you just think of this past week, of things that you read about. You read about women who were going through ranger school. You've read about literally how we are changing, people are changing their sexuality and transgender, becoming more true to themselves. So you got shifts in that. I was really struck with two of my grandsons we were talking about. I was joking with them because about gender dysphoria, because I have a Labrador that has that. And as we were watching, and I said that, and then they said, yeah, Grandpa, and you know, it's a topic for us. And I said, why? Well, we're both, one's in the 7th grade, one's in the 9th grade. And we both have friends who are going through that, figuring it out. And we're trying to help them with the language of, do we say he, do we say she, do we say they, what do we do? We live in a time where the issues of acceptance of gay marriage, it seems like that's almost ancient history now, isn't it? Because of the way that it's been accepted. So things sexually are really changing. I want you to appreciate, though, how far we have come. Because sex, and John's quite right about the way that it is wired into us, but we have assumptions about what goes into healthy sexuality that you and I share. We all share. But in fact, it's a relatively recent kind of thought in human history. In Roman times, Greek times, the chances of being abused sexually as a child, they call it the universality of incest. It's what happened to children. It's what happened. Unless you were from a noble family, it happened to everybody. And people lived shorter lives. So the whole course of this, they were gone by the time they were 30. Now we're living, and so a relationship, and John was talking about the duration of things. Well, people didn't live that long. That's how we were wired. And the fact is that it started to evolve in history, starting with this painting, which is about the legend of Saint Joachim and Anna. And the story goes that she and the two of them loved each other, but didn't have any children. They quote, barren. And they felt immense shame about this. So much so that he left the city and he went into the desert. Because obviously God was unhappy with him. And he went out there and lived in deprivation. And there came a point where he saw an angel who came to him and said that this is unnecessary. And he went back to the city and he met Anna at the door. And this is what, and I blew it up for you to look at it. Because it's interesting to me, if you look at how Giotto caught the elderly part of their faces, and her hand in his hair, and the love that was between them. And the thing that's striking about it is it was a memorialization of the fact that you could love someone and it didn't have to be about children. It could be that you loved somebody. And that idea that it wasn't about propagation, didn't have to be about children, but it could be about the relationship, is an extraordinarily departure in history. And taking responsibility for your sexuality was a new kind of thinking that occurred as we emerged out of the Middle Ages. And one of the things that goes with that is that if you think about this day and time, we've evolved out of these ideas where we protect children, we can have relationships that are independent of reproducing, that can go on at a time of extraordinary change. Because as John talked about it, one of the things to think about is the fact that we are starting to have to think also about what mental health is. In other words, we can observe how we humans operate sexually, romantically, relationally. And the fact of the matter is, when you start thinking about mental health, you have to stop and think about what a big change that was. So, for example, this painting comes from the French Revolution. And what you have here is you have one of the early pioneers in medicine. The whole spirit of the French Revolution said everybody deserves to be respected, including the people in an insane asylum. And so what they're doing in the picture is they're taking the chains off the inmates in the insane asylum. And as democracy emerged, and the idea of respect for every person, the idea of being mentally healthy, that even if you have problems with it, that you deserve to have dignity. Now, a painting only made about 25 years later, coming out of England. It's another insane asylum, and it's a Sunday afternoon. And what the king and the queen would do, and the court, is they would go to the insane asylum to look at the inmates for amusement. The nobles and the court would see how funny the insane people who had mental problems, that they were amused by that, ridiculed. Now, I wonder if we have changed. You ever stand in the grocery store and you come by the various magazines right by the cash register and you kind of take it, you don't really buy it. You just want to see what it's saying, right? And what it's talking about people who have what? Mental health problems. How crazy she is. She's got all the beautiful voice, all this money, been through rehab 5 times. Why can't she get it? What's wrong with her? People who get into sexual trouble. People who have mental health problems then are looked at as people who have poor character. And yet the reality is, and there's a book that recently came out by a guy, the name of Agony, a psychiatrist in New York, and he talked about what he called a first-rate madness. And he pointed out something that is, we've learned about addictions. In fact, there's a lot of research about the fact that people of great achievement use their brains like addicts do, which is why people of so much talent are often have problems with addiction. And what Gaemi says is really interesting. He says, if you look at our history, the people whom we most admire, our greatest inventors, Edison, for example, Abraham Lincoln, bipolar. He struggled with bipolar illness. You had John Kennedy, Martin Luther King. They both, when they made their deal, high on steroids, amphetamines, and other things. Winston Churchill was drunk through most of World War II. The fact is, he says, that without Steve Jobs' OCD, you wouldn't have Apple. In other words, what I'm trying to say is people who have struggled with mental health are our greatest assets. They've been our greatest leaders. What Gaemi says, in fact, if your country's in trouble, you don't want a mentally healthy president. You have someone who's going to think outside of the box and figure out how to do it. But in our culture, the fact of the matter is that we see them as amusing. And I think of it, it's important for us to think about this because, in fact, we in the recovery community, why can we persist in dismissing people and their struggles? I'll tell you why it happens, by the way, that they repeat treatment. I've just witnessed this so many times. Person comes to treatment and they're a celebrity or they're in a band or they're high-profile financial figure, whatever it is. They have handlers who, when you come out of treatment and you have said you've got to do these things in order for you to stay sober, and the handler says, if you don't go on the tour, if you don't do this, if you don't do this, you're going to lose everything. And the reason they want them to do it is because their income stops if they're not on the road doing those things. So they don't give them a chance for that long-term deep recovery that's necessary, the kind of effort that it takes to build a recovery, to have that sense of self so you can be in a relationship. So what I think that it's important to think about is that part of the problem is us, the recovering community. Because what we're talking about is what? We're talking about addiction as a major mental health issue, and the fact that you can deal with mental health as an issue is what this place is about. People come here to get help. It's not about shame, but that they can get help, and they can change, and they can actually improve their brains and bring it to a higher level of functioning than they ever could have without having that struggle. That getting into therapy is a good thing. And the fact of the matter is that we have not spoken up on behalf of this. And even though it's a real crisis in this time, now think about it. Right now, we are seeing extraordinary changes that are happening sexually. 2/3 of our junior high students are being actively sexual on the internet. Their parents don't know that. 40% of both boys and girls start their pornography at the age, who are doing that, started at the age of 10. 34% of them, which works out to be between the ages of 12 and 16, 34% of them are going to go on to have a lifelong problem with sexual compulsivity. To the extent that it's changing how medicine is tracking things. For example, throat cancer. Throat cancer used to be the major cause of throat cancer was either nicotine or alcohol. You know what it is now? HPV, the virus that kids transmit with oral sex in junior high, and it's so widespread that throat cancer, the leading cause of it is HPV, and the whole onset, instead of the middle 50s, it's now in the early 30s. So we changed what the cost of throat cancer was. You think about our culture, and you think about the things that are going on, like, for example, if you take alcohol and drugs, we spend about $500 billion a year. That's what it costs us. It's not an innocent issue. Prescription drugs and internet porn are the main reasons that kids drop out in freshman year of college. 30% of our adults are obese. 30% of our elementary children are obese. Our elementary children right now have a shorter life expectancy than the people in this room because they already have a problem with obesity. If you start adding it up, drugs, alcohol, nicotine, obesity, food, sex, and the medical costs, it is our number one public health problem. So, why don't we deal with it? I think it partly is us, but it's changing. I was on an airplane flying to Atlanta, and I was sitting next to a movie producer, and he's filming chase scenes, car scenes in Atlanta. I love cars. I love machines, so I wanted to hear how he did it. We're talking. Talked to him about 4 or 5 minutes, and I started to hear words that were recovery words. And I said, "You got to be in the program." He said, "Well, how'd you know?" And I said, "Well, you just don't use words like that unless you're going to have the program." He says, "Well, it's true. I've been in AA for 4 years. All of us in Hollywood end up there." And he says, actually, this whole country's got such a huge problem. And then he looked at me and says, "Do you know anything about sex addiction?" Well, I said, "Well, I know a little bit about it. I've been in the program since 1977. So, I've been in for my own recovery." He says, "Well, I have 3 sponsees, and they're sex addicts as well as alcoholics." Now, I get it. He says, "I just was at closure of a movie, and there was a bottle of wine passed around, and I didn't have any, and it wasn't a problem for me. But what I thought about is the fact there were 8 of us having dinner, celebrating finishing the movie, and that wine bottle came around, and I saw there was about a quarter of the bottle left. And I said to myself, even though I've been in recovery for a long time, how do they do that? I mean, how does that happen? If it was me and I was drinking, we'd have gone through a number of bottles by now and a lot more. He says, so I get the problem. I understand the problem. And these three guys that I'm seeing have enough sexual energy to fire up and electrify a third world country. He says, the problem is they're doing things that are hurting them so bad that I had to say to him, you're not listening to your SAA sponsor, you're not listening to your therapist, and I, as your AA sponsor, I can't watch this. So I've had to fire. I'd fire him. Does that happen? I said, it happens often. It's a tough addiction. He says, we in AA make a big mistake. We talk about singularity of purpose, and when those of you who've heard that phrase know what it means, we don't talk about anything but alcohol. And he says, there's none of us in that room that doesn't have other issues. And if we don't start talking across and speaking up and kind of supporting one another and supporting all kinds of recovery, we're going to lose this thing. And I think he's right. No disease entity got what it needed until people who had the problem were willing to stand up and be counted. And that's the issue. And I think that problem is us, and the problem is that we need to learn to speak our truth about what our life experience is. Now, you heard John and talked about his addictions. He does it well and funny, and he's so good about it. I'll tell you what I've learned about this. What I've learned, I was married to a woman for 20 years, and she died in 2010. When I married her, I wasn't sure that I could do this. Because in my life, I hadn't done it well. But this marriage worked. It was a happy marriage. And at the end, she got cancer that was untreatable. And she had 3 very horrible years. Hard to watch. But I'll tell you what we've learned. One of the things we realized at the end of our relationship, we talked about the fact that we always thought that there would be more time for us to enjoy the relationship. And in a way, we hadn't really shown up for each other because we were busy with stuff. It's one of the things that's getting in the way of our relationships is there's so many distractions. We have our cell phones, we have our text messages, we have all of the demands of things, and we kind of miss out on actually being with one another. And in making that assumption, what happens is that can be taken away from you. I was talking with a colleague this morning, and one of the things we're talking about this issue, and if you're in a partnership now, one of the things I can tell you, there's a 50% probability you're going to watch your partner die. And it's going to change you. Changes your perspective because you start to think about the opportunities that you missed, that we were distracted and we lost our focus in our relationship. Then, after Susie died, one of the things that I got to do was the codependent's dream. I got to read her journals. And when I was reading her, talking about her daily life, every now and then I would see things about what it was like to be with me. And I didn't like what I read. About ways that I made priorities, ways that she wanted me to be with her that she had told me. I remember her telling me, but I had missed that. And it changed how I wanted to be in a relationship. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking, John, is when she died, one of the things that, and we had a friend who warned me and said, be prepared for the physical withdrawal. Because it's not like a divorce, but you lose someone you love and you've been with for a long time. Like there's those studies where they put people in fMRIs and where they give them a little shock and the anxiety went way up and then it would calm down if you had a nice nurse. But when the spouse that you've been with for decades came in and put her hand on you, the anxiety went down. And it's like what happens is there's a way in which the brains start to join together. And you become part of one another. And when one goes, it leaves an emptiness that you're unprepared for. And I experienced that. I experienced the loss of it, like that there was part of me that was gone. And it's now 5.5 years later, and I still will have moments like that. Now you go on with life. But in therapy, I realized that, and I had to think, how did I show up for my children? How did I show up for my wife? And then I got married again this year to a woman from Texas. Now she's a widow. And when two widows hook up, it's like having a foursome. Really. I mean, I know she still loves her husband, and I still love my wife. Nothing's ever going to change that about either one of us. And if they came back today, we both agreed, all four of us would be in bed together. That's the way that would be. And it changes your perspective about other things too, because there are little problems that come up. Like, for example, I have a set of plots, and I said, you know, I'm going to be there, and Susie's going to be in there, like you to join me when that time comes. And she says, well, Wes is down in Texas. I said, honey, we'll just dig them up and bring them up and put them in there. That's fine. But I'll tell you the difference this time for both of us. We both really understand the part about how it can be taken away from you. And John and I have been talking about that. But even in terms of our relationships and people that we've known in the recovery movement who are now gone. You all have had the experience of losing people. You know how that can happen. There is no really any human security. So why do this? Why do this thing called recovery, put all this work in and work on these relationships and get better so that the world is better? It's because we as human beings, our brains crave that need for making things better. That's that thing that makes for achievement. And if we don't commit to where our passions are, is when addictions can take over. Because the brain is going to do something that has a challenge to it. So what I want to share with you is a couple things about that. And one is that we have been doing some research, and I just want to review the ways that courtship can go wrong. It's very interesting. Because we have found, for example, that there are what we call higher order kinds of issues that are beyond just being an exhibitionist or having a problem with compulsive affairs or what have you. Those are kind of like single mountains. But there are these larger things which are kind of like a mountain range, and there's 7 of them. And I'm just going to show you this briefly because it's kind of a way that, as John said, that the things that we have that can go awry and that are present in our culture. For example, one of the things that came up is S&M behavior, in which people were really hurtful to one another, hostility and taking advantage of the vulnerable in a relationship, sexualized attachment, like the stalking that John was talking about, how when it gets to the point where you romanticize and obsess with somebody that you will follow them. There's a whole new one where you become on the internet into an isolated self-stimulation. You go into another universe, especially if you start early in life and you can't leave it. It's like being in a bubble. And swinging in public and anonymous sex, networking for anonymous sex, like on the internet, and finally drug and sex trade, prostitution, what have you. What we found, the most densely associated mental health issues were on this end, with S&M. When you read 50 Shades of Grey, that's what you're talking about. 50 Shades of Grey is one of the best-selling books ever. And it's built on a model that came in a movie in which you had, it's called Twilight. Do you know about Twilight? Twilight, a $5 billion book, a series of books. And I went with my granddaughter to the first Twilight movie, and I realized, Jacob takes off his shirt, and there's 45-year-old women and kids, and there's women, they're screaming, and I realize I'm one of 5 men in the whole theater. And my granddaughter says to me, she says, "Grandpa, you're actually watching the movie." I said, "Yeah, because I'm looking at Bella, whose love choices are a vampire and a werewolf, and she's torn between the two of them. This is the guy who wrote Betrayal Bond. Of course I'm going to be interested in this." I go through the airport, and I got the third one under my arm, and the TSA lady, I had a little infraction. She said to the guys, "He can go through." And I heard her say to guys, "Why'd you let him go through?" "He's reading the book." And I get in the plane, I'm reading the book, go up, fly, land, and as we land, the woman behind me taps my shoulder, and she says, "I see you're reading the book." And the woman across me says, "Yeah, I saw he was reading it too." And the woman said, "Yeah, I saw it too." I said, "Yeah, I got a 16-year-old granddaughter." And I'm trying to figure out what's the fascination with the book in which you would seek someone who would hurt you or was dangerous to you. It's the thing that John was talking about in romantic stress, the whole idea of setting aside obvious danger. In our culture, there's actually a very long history of that theme that goes back to a 1954 book called The Flower and the Flame, which was the first romance novel that was ever written. It's still a bestseller all these years later. Exploiting the vulnerable, taking advantage of people, being attracted to them because they need you as a rescuer. Sexualized attachment, which is the stalking part. And these four here all have high-density mental health issues that go with them. Swinging and public anonymous sex starts, there's issues, but not like the others. Networking for anonymous sex, not a lot of associated mental health issues. They really are just sex addicts. Drug addicts and the sex trade, escorts, what have you. Also, not a lot of psychopathology. It's not the same density. What I'm trying to tell you is that we are getting to a place where we are seeing patterns and ways of looking at this that we were never able to see before. And what we're looking at here, folks, is we have got a crisis going because we are not looking at addiction, and we have kids who are digitally involved and they are altering their brains. And they're doing it, and it starts really with video games, which teaches them to learn by getting better, different, novelty, going on to the next one, what have you. And then when you apply that to sexuality, they translate that into relationships. And nobody's speaking up about the problem and getting respect for those people who are trying to do something about recovery. And I think what we need to look at as a community of recovering people, and the phrase I'd like to use is, I think that people have what we call convenient recovery. And the truth is, recovery is really inconvenient. Recovery requires that when we see something in the community, when we see an editorial, when we see somebody laughing, that we take on this issue and speak up as a recovering community. When the council is doing its work and getting more people to come to 12-step meetings and to get into recovery and to do the longer therapy, that we support those kinds of things. I think it's like this. People go to meetings and they say they give back, and you do when you help people in the program. And in fact, in attachment, one of the things that has been proven is the thing that is the biggest single predictor of success in a 12-step program is not that you were a sponsee, but that you were a sponsor. So there is this giving back. But there's another way we can give back, which is to not let the comment in the editorial go, not let people who are doing the work like the council, supporting them in all the ways that we can, like you are tonight by coming here, but speaking up. And if we do that, I found this little clip that I think that can make for extraordinary change, where recovery is not about how you've lost it or there's something wrong with you, but that it's a badge of courage, and it's about a more enlightened self. The fact is, the whole culture needs to learn what that means, because almost everybody in it could use this kind of help. That's what I think we got to do, is we got to speak out. And we have to work together. And that's what I have to say tonight. So do you know what the difference between sensuality and kinky is?
Personally?
Sensuality is using a feather. Kinky is using the whole chicken.
What's kinky?
Kinky's losing the whole chicken. I've been saving that up for you, Johnny.
Oh, that's
You can use that one.
That's a great line. I mean, it's a great joke. I love it.
So, this all started about 10 years ago. You and I had a conversation that was filmed. We've both done our shtick now, so we can have a conversation, and then we can involve these guys, right? Since that time, do you remember the story when we were going to film that?
Say again.
When we were going to film in 2004, we filmed the first conversation between you and I.
Yes.
And I had my appendix out.
Yep.
And you couldn't find me.
Oh, right.
And you started going
my
through the
God.
hospitals looking for me, and then you had a heart problem because you were in the hospital. We both ended up in the hospital when last time we were filming.
I know it. I know it. So we're going to have to watch out. But it's great to be together and to listen to you. And once again, what your point at the end, it's so much better to be doing this with colleagues. And, you know, sometimes you do feel alone as a therapist, you know, unless you have a good support system, which you've always recommended. I didn't have that in the beginning, but I realized the power of having other people express and help you, you know, just like we're both having a little bit of health issues, and I've kind of been the forerunner of it. And Pat was saying, well, I'm not glad you had it, but it's glad to hear, because you kind of feel really alone when they first diagnose you with something. I have spinal stenosis, I have heart trouble, I have COPD. I mean, I don't want to give you an organ recital. My mama I'd call her and I'd think, oh my God, it's an organ recital. Your Aunt Chickie's liver is bad. Your Aunt Margie, whatever. So, but it's great, the power of having people share. And I mean, look at it. All these movements, a whole bunch of people get together and they make something happen in extraordinary ways. So, I mean, I think that's a great thing to keep saying and talking about, and welcoming everybody, you know, into the work. And this, you know, this isn't just Pat and I doing stuff. It's, I mean, I think my whole life has had followers and people promoting it and then getting on fire because they like the idea and moving on with their own lives. It's just been astonishing to see the people who transform and then move on in their own life and their own strength. But still, we need that support always. We need somebody to talk to and share. That's why I'm so glad I have you and I have Claudia Black she's a senior fellow at the Meadows also. She's another great pioneer in 76 or 7, right when you were doing your stuff, she was coming out with stuff on alcoholic families. And I mean, that stuff saved my life when I first saw it, you know, and put it together. And then Pat was totally instrumental in me becoming completely sexually sober.
You know, one of the things I heard Claudia recently present on that she had never really talked about before, but she had talked about the beginnings of ACA and adult children of alcoholics and how that program grew and changed. And one of the things she talked about was her fear of putting that together, of rejection by the therapeutic community and by the community at large. That was her biggest fear. And I've been thinking about you and I, because I know for me, one of the hardest things historically I was so afraid when Out of the Shadows came out. What I did is there was a small, true confession here, John. There was a small advance, a couple $100, and I went and I bought Bluebill decoys. Because the one thing I could do was to go hunting so I could forget what I'd just done, was turning in that manuscript and getting that check. What was going to happen to me? I knew that my life was going to change. And Claudia talked about that moment. Did you have a moment like that?
Well, when I did Bradshaw and the Family, I was all on fire. I'd just done 2 years of therapy myself, kind of done what I'd been telling everybody else to do. Then I did that PBS program. I was on fire when I did that. There were people in the North that said I couldn't watch it. You were too angry. Well, I hadn't worked through all my stuff, but I went into panic after that was over because I'm not a licensed psychiatrist. I'm not a PhD, although I should be. I spent 4 years at Rice, never finished it, but anyway. But the fear of being attacked by the clinical community, but also by, well, in my case, born-again Christians. I feared religious rigidity because I was trying in my own way. I'd been 10 years in a seminary, studying to be a Catholic priest. I had a lot of background in theology. I had a degree in theology. But I was trying to loosen up,
You got there, John.
Yeah. And
loose is not the word people use, actually.
I know. Well, and I know the struggle too that Pat had was there was a kind of a rigid clinical bunch that if you couldn't prove everything by some kind of criterion that they had, then it wasn't right. And he had to struggle with the idea that there was sexual addiction. There were people, and still are, avidly against that idea completely. And phenomenologically, meaning what we've observed is immense freedom and health that's come out of that. And then you got these people that are sitting up there, they're sticklers for detail, and where have you proved that? Some of their proof is a guy with 35 higher education guys, Kohlberg at Harvard, and 25 or 35 guys in the study, and he's coming out with conclusions. A guy claims he's the only scientific psychologist in America. I won't name his name, but his samples are so small. And phenomenologically, we know, I've heard people say, AA never helped anybody. You have no data on AA. And I was just thrown out of a group one time because I was talking about my recovery in AA. And they just said, well, there's no data to support it. So we've had to put up with a lot of that along, and I'm all for it. I think it's great to have data. Pat's done a lot of research in the last 20 years, and it's great to have it, but when you know phenomenologically it's happening. I know my life changed. I know hundreds of people whose lives are changed. Then you got to get away from some of that kind of scientific patriarchal rigidity. And anyway, I wrote a whole book working through my own moral life with that, getting clear of that patriarchal upbringing that I'd had. Anyway, it's...
See, I think that's part of what the sexual stuff we're talking about. Because what we don't realize is while we think of, protecting children and having relationships and the luxury we have of sitting here together, the United Nations released a statistic last fall that across this planet, there are 200 million women who are not alive today that should be, because they lived in countries in which women weren't valued, or if they did transgressions, they were killed. And the result is at 200 million people, that's more than a Holocaust, that's more than any war, that is an incredible statistic. And the fact is, this movement to sexuality and we're partnering where men and women can respect each other reduces violence in the culture. The collaboration and effectiveness of a culture shifts. And so the model that we come up with, which is why I think sexual recovery is so important, because our problem is abundance. We have too much of everything. Either too much or too little. And our country keeps borrowing money. We have got one of the most expensive medical systems in the world, and we aren't the healthiest people. And it's primarily because of addiction. And it's all about abundance. And yet, as we become technologically more developed worldwide, as other countries follow us, we are the model then of sexually, how do we govern ourselves? How do we collaborate? How do we work together? How do we show up for one another? It starts with how men and women treat each other. And so it's not just that sexual recovery, really, people who are in sexual recovery are doing something the whole culture needs to know, because the sexual options that are becoming available for all of us are extraordinary. And how do we make choices that really fit who we are and are rewarding, and for which we don't have to give up ourselves in order to be in, but that it can be enriching. And I think, as we live longer, you think about getting married at the age of 20 and the life expectancy, they say if you live another 8 years, it's going to be extended well past 100, up to 120. If that's true, you get married at 20, that's 100 years, same person. Gives you pause to think, Johnny.
Well, I'm pretty overwhelmed by it all. I wanted to ask you something. I saw a figure the other day that people spend $100 billion on cybersex. Is that accurate, or have you heard a number like that?
Well, yeah, and in fact, what's interesting about this country, we are the world's #1 producer of pornography, producing over 400 million pages of pornography last year alone. And no country comes close to us, which is why in the more patriarchal world, where women are owned kind of thing, okay? So when they go on the web, they think Americans are really crazy because they can't control their women. And you have 35 million women, it's estimated, that are on the web somehow being sexual. And how does that happen?
35 million? Mm-hmm. Good Lord. And so I don't know much about the internet. No, I mean.
So the fact is that when those guys plowed into the Twin Towers, do you know how they communicated? In that all they sent pornography to one another. We have colleagues, mental health professionals, whose full-time job it is in looking at how various terrorist organizations communicate, because they're being very clever, because they're burying their messages within pornographic clips. So we have PhD level mental health people looking at pornography day after day to find those messages. So one of the things to understand is that terrorism really isn't about religion in some ways. Terrorism is really fear of what would happen if a woman could be strong and powerful. There's a lot of fear. And I think, you know, for men, and you joked about this, but the fact is women are better at fighting than we are. You know, I mean, they think fast.
I totally agree with that.
They
I have no argument with that.
I mean, and they can remember things. You know, they say, oh yeah, you had that crazy tie on and it was 7:30, September 29th. I remember that night well, and you had done this, and I can't even remember what year she's talking about.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, so it's hard to fight with it. So I think that there is this thing, there is fear, and it's a lot about sexuality that's behind what's going on in the terrorism part of it. The reason I know this is because within the CSAT community, we were approached by those mental health professionals because they asked, how do you do this where you listen to sexual stuff all day and still maintain your sanity? And we had a number of things that we could help them with that, but that's how we learned about all that.
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting point, because I think the whole belief is that it's this radical Islam, and I don't think you could make people do what they do just by saying God wants you to do it. I'm not sure you can do that. There's got to be something else going on there. There's got to be something on the affective level, passion, and you know, this is a great thing to think about, because those people still are killing homosexuals, and it's just barbaric when you think about it. It's just barbaric. Russia and the Saudi Arabia, and I just am dumbfounded by it and don't have a clue of what to do about it, but whatever.
Well, I think what goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and I'd like to take it to the audience, let them ask us a few questions because we're getting close to our time, Johnny. We're kind of stick with. And we both behaved very well tonight. You know?
We did what?
We behaved very well tonight.
Oh, we
thought.
did.
Yes.
And, when Pat and I were doing workshops together,
We didn't behave very well.
we did one called we were doing one on sexual shame, the Agony and the Ecstasy, and I'd get up there. I was on the ecstasy part. I made Pat take the agony part. But anyway, I was up there and I'd get carried away, and one day I said, nobody knows anything about God. You know, the room, you couldn't hear a pin drop. And about 10 minutes later, this voice comes from John, it's God. It's him magnifying his voice. And it kind of frightened me, to tell you the truth. I thought, I'm going to get caught up with here. But we've always had this. We're Irish boys. We're Catholic.
Do you remember
boys.
what God said to you that day?
What? Oh, I didn't hear, but I probably heard, but I repressed it.
God said to you, John Bradshaw, are you aware that sex is pleasurable, that you have a sex organ and it's pleasurable?
Really?
There's just one thing.
Yeah.
You can't use it.
Yeah,
It's the one time I upstaged you that I felt I really did it well.
Well, I mean, that was, I mean, what a great thing, because that's what I was taught growing up. I mean, I had these wonderful holy penguins teaching me, you know, and they were talking about how wonderful sex was, and they're all celibate, you know, and it's like, what a crazy, and Pat and I have both, we've had some real good workshops with this stuff, how confusing it all is. telling you it's the most wonderful thing in the world, but you can't do it, and God's watching your every, that eye of God thing, very frightening.
Well, and sex is dirty. Save it for someone you love, if you remember that.
And actually, that is funny, but it's the males that I know that it's not kind of the classic clinical anorexia, but they can't have sex unless it's dirty, so you don't do it with somebody you love. And how many guys shut down, not just because of the brain program, but because of this mental belief that it's got to be dirty and you have to, and then all my templates of arousal had to be changed when I sobered up. They were all had to be dirty. I mean, whatever dirty means. But anyway, God, I do remember I repressed what God said that day.
I remember as a Catholic kid being warned about Lutheran girls.
What about what?
Lutheran girls.
Oh, yeah.
They bring you to sin?
Huh?
They bring you to sin.
Oh, yeah.
Then,
mine were Baptist girls. I'm sorry about anybody Baptist.
I married a Lutheran,
That's good.
It's true.
That's funny, Patrick.
Or a couple of you, have we generated a question or two between all the stuff that we've done tonight? Somebody who'd like to?
First of all, thank you both for being here tonight. You spoke about in your work about all the opposition that you kept running across, about, I guess, people's fear of sexuality.
Yes.
What do you think that's about?
Well, I think it's about prejudice and fear of what would happen if we were different, and if we accepted diversity, and if we accepted the power that is in each other. I think one of the things that I think about, and perhaps you remember this old story about Sir Gawain. Do you know the story of Sir Gawain? Sir Gawain had a friend named Lancelot, and he wanted the Holy Grail. And in order to get the Holy Grail, there was a witch who could help him, but she was ugly. And Lancelot went to her and said, I really want to get the Holy Grail. And the witch says, fine, but I want to marry Sir Gawain. You got to get him to marry me. So Lancelot went to Sir Gawain and said, you got to marry the witch. I know she's ugly and what have you, but if you marry her, I can go get the Holy Grail. So Gawain agreed to do that because he knew that this was Lancelot's quest. So he went to meet with the witch. And she says, are you willing to marry me? And he said yes, and she transformed into a beautiful woman. And she says, you have a choice. You can have me as the ugly old hag, or you can have me beautiful like this. But it's going to be, I'm either going to be one with your friends and at court, and a day I can be beautiful and an old hag during the night, or at night when we sleep together, I can be beautiful, and during the day you will be with an old hag. Which do you want? And he said, I think that's your choice. And she said, for that, I will always be beautiful because you have given me dominion over myself. And so the reality is, I think that's what, in a relationship, what our fear often is. It's about allowing the other person to have dominion over themselves and trusting that that's going to work. If that makes sense to you. You're welcome.
You had touched on a point of singularity of purpose.
Yes.
Post-detonate programs. And yet you were also talking about the need for the recovery community to rally together and work together
Yes.
as one. We have a situation here in Houston where we started a meeting that crossed over 3 or 4 different S-type 12-step programs.
Right.
In which we were affiliated with all of them. Now we run into a situation where one of them has discovered that they weren't the only SAA or S-type program with the affiliation. And so we've been delisted. And we're concerned about the singularity of purpose within 12-step programs where they won't allow this cross programming going on, where we could work as one rather than an individual 12-step program.
Yeah. I think the issue in all things, really, I mean, whether it be religion or politics or whatever, you get people who are fundamentalistic and religiosity kinds of things, and they take something that is a recipe and they make it sacerdotal. And what I mean by that, I see John nodding his head, sacerdotal means sacramental. You make it holier than it is. It's a recipe. And the reality is that all the fellowships can really learn from one another, including the S fellowships. They all got stuff that they can give one another. It's by pooling things. And the true secret is having a good meeting. and trying to get people to conform to certain kinds of rule systems in a sort of religious way is what the Pharisees were about. That's what Jesus was talking about. It's like that kind of eldest brother, to use the prodigal son analogy, and of being righteous and right is where the problem is. And that's not only in churches, but it's really also in the 12-step communities. It's also in the professional communities. So that we could get psychiatry and family therapy and the people who work in the trauma side of the world and the sexuality side of the world to start talking to each other in different ways, because all of therapy is now about to be elevated. The research that we're doing, and I appreciate the kind comments John has made, but what I really truly believe, in 10 years, we're going to be in a different world therapeutically. And it's because people are willing to collaborate and talk one another. I also believe the 12-step communities have got to start talking to each other differently. You can learn a lot from Debtors Anonymous no matter what fellowship you're in. You can learn a lot from ACA no matter what fellowship you're in. So the fact is that I think we are now going to watch where the 12-step communities are going to emerge, where there's common ground, where the fellowships are going to be informing and teaching one another, and there's going to be a body of recovery knowledge, I foresee, that will literally be a new level of thinking about what does it mean to be in recovery. That's what I see happening. And it's questions like that, that's happening throughout all of our community. But we don't have much time.
Well, one of the things, too, if you realize how rigid and fundamental it is to drink alcohol every day. I mean, that your life, every problem is changed in your life by drinking. So that drinking becomes a holy kind of thing. And addicts have that mindset of rigidity. And so you get these people, I mean, my God, I think of some of those guys 50 years ago. If somebody brought up that they were having trouble with multiple affairs, oh my God, they'd run them out of the room. And just rigid, you had to talk about alcohol, and that was it. If we could grasp more, and I think Bill W. talked about it. He was already talking about codependency. And the core of codependency is shame, and what that core creates is addictiveness. That people are constantly trying to fill up something that isn't there, whether it's sex, whether it's gambling, whether it's whatever. We just need to keep, talk. I mean, my name is John, and my addictiveness took the form of alcohol. My addictiveness took the form of cocaine. Now, whether we'll ever get that or not, because there are some people that rise up and try to control AA meetings, as you well know. My God. But that's that absolute rigidity. And, part of really becoming enlightened is lightening up. That's what Buddha said. Lighten up. And we need to get that free child in there, that, move from childish to childlike and have fun. And those guys aren't fun. They're not fun to me, and they drive me nuts.
Do you think we get more fun as we're older?
What, Patrick?
That we get more fun as we are getting older?
I'm trying to.
I read that.
I got my man Pedro. He takes me to the racetrack now. I'm crippled. I love to go out there.
I heard that the human brain reaches its epitome at 65, John.
Really?
Yeah, I'm still waiting for the surge myself.
Well, I think you got a lot of fun. I saw you in Reno one time. And we were having a big time and laughing and playing. And I mean, to me, it's adult play. And my God, I'm 82 right now, guys. And you get toward the end and you got heart disease, COPD, steroid-induced diabetes. I can't hear. I can't, whatever. It just, the battery just starts running out. So you better do it while you can. You better have all the fun while you can. Because what is life anyway? We don't know. I mean, I hope there's a lot more, but I don't know.
We don't know.
I'm sorry, God.
We don't know if there's more time. We can't count on it.
Well, we can't.
But I think, John, we're past our time.
Okay.
So, come here.
Hey. That's it, guys. That's it.